Secrets have a way of living quietly in the background until the moment they erupt, tearing apart everything you thought was certain. What looks like a simple story of love and loyalty slowly unravels into betrayal, arrogance, and a cruel plan that nearly robs a woman of everything she holds dear. Yet hidden in the shadows lies a truth her enemies never expected. A twist so powerful it turns humiliation into triumph and exposes the danger of underestimating someone's strength. Before we dive in, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what you think might unfold. You won't want to miss how this story turns on its head. Alicia Brown was a proud black woman who carried the lessons of her upbringing like armor. She had grown up on the south side of Atlanta, raised by her father Robert Brown, a maintenance supervisor at a small factory, and her mother Margaret, who sang in the church choir and worked as a seamstress. Their family never had much money, but what they lacked in wealth, they made up for in dignity, discipline, and unconditional love. From her father, Alicia learned that self-worth is never measured by income or skin color, but by character and compassion. From her mother, she inherited resilience, a voice of reason, and the ability to stand tall even when life seemed determined to push her down. These lessons shaped Alicia into the woman she became, a dedicated high school English teacher who poured her heart into guiding her students, especially those who felt unseen by the world. To them, she was more than a teacher. She was a mentor, a confidant, and a reminder that their dreams mattered. She believed this calling was enough to define her life. But then Richard Miller entered the picture. Richard was everything Alicia never thought she needed: tall, confident, and unmistakably white, with the air of someone who had grown up knowing he belonged in every room. He came from an affluent family that had lived in Buckhead for generations, attended elite schools, and worked as a polished investment banker in a firm that symbolized power in the city. They met at a charity gala Alicia only attended because a colleague begged her to come. She almost didn't go, feeling like she didn't belong among the gowns and diamonds, but fate intervened that evening. Richard spotted her from across the room, her natural curls pinned with understated elegance, her deep brown skin glowing under the chandeliers, her warm laughter carrying over the stiff conversations of the wealthy. He approached her, smooth and self-assured, and introduced himself. Alicia was caught off guard but flattered. When he asked about her work, she spoke about her students with pride, and he listened with a kind of attentiveness that felt rare. For a black woman who had often been overlooked or underestimated, his interest seemed like validation. Their romance unfolded quickly. Richard sent flowers to her school, whisked her to dinners in places she had only read about, and charmed her with gifts that made her colleagues whisper in awe. He drove her in luxury cars, opened doors, and treated her like royalty. For a while, Alicia believed her fairy tale had arrived. When Richard proposed in the middle of Piedmont Park 6 months later, dropping to one knee with a ring so dazzling it seemed to catch the eyes of the entire city, Alicia said yes without hesitation. She believed their love could bridge differences in class and color, that her father's wisdom about character would hold true. Her mother, cautious but supportive, reminded her to guard her heart. But Alicia was convinced this was destiny. At first, married life felt like a dream. Richard introduced her to new circles, his family, and his wealthy friends. Alicia tried to carry herself with grace even when she felt out of place, smiling politely as she listened to conversations about stocks and vacations in Europe. She often spoke proudly about her students, their struggles, and their triumphs. But Richard began to chip away at her confidence. At first, it was subtle, small comments like, "It's sweet that you want to help kids," said with a patronizing smile. Then it grew sharper. At dinner parties, when asked what Alicia did, he would say, "Oh, she's just a teacher," in a tone that made her profession sound trivial. Each time, Alicia forced a smile, but her heart sank. She began to notice the way Richard would glance at her when she spoke, as though her words were interruptions in the serious conversations of adults. His friends would chuckle when he silenced her with, "Sweetheart, let us handle this," and Alicia would excuse herself, hiding her humiliation behind a glass of wine. Richard also began to dismiss her father's memory. Robert Brown had passed away from cancer when Alicia was 25, leaving behind memories of a man who worked hard his entire life without ever asking for recognition. To Alicia, he was a hero. To Richard, he was just a blue-collar worker. Richard would say things like, "It's fine, not everyone can be successful," as if wealth defined worth. When Alicia grew emotional remembering her father, Richard would sigh, "You have to move on. Dwelling on the past won't change where you came from." His words stabbed at her pride, not just as a daughter, but as a black woman proud of her roots. She began to feel small in her own home. While Alicia clung to the love story she believed in, Richard was slowly setting the stage for control. He enjoyed reminding her that she was lucky he had chosen her. He framed himself as the man who had elevated her from her ordinary world into his realm of luxury. What Alicia mistook for protection was really possession. She thought patience would preserve their bond, but Richard saw patience as weakness. He believed her silence meant compliance. Her modest background meant she would never challenge him. He would host his colleagues in their immaculate home, pouring expensive wine and discussing market trends. And when Alicia tried to join the conversation with her own observations about education, poverty, or community programs, Richard would cut her off with that smirk she was beginning to despise. "Sweetheart," he would say, "let the adults handle this." And his guests, mostly white and wealthy like him, would laugh as though her words were a joke. Alicia would force herself to smile, retreating to the kitchen to hide the sting. Alone, she would remember her father's words about dignity, about never letting anyone make her feel less. But in those moments she felt small, reduced to a silent figure in her own home. Richard's dismissive attitude toward her career grew sharper as time passed. "It's nice that you want to help those kids," he said one evening, "but let's be honest, your job isn't exactly making an impact on the world." Alicia stared at him, incredulous, thinking of the countless students she had guided, the ones who had hugged her with tears in their eyes because she had believed in them when no one else did. But Richard waved it off as if teaching was a hobby, as if her calling meant nothing compared to his financial success. What hurt even more was how he began to belittle her background in ways that revealed the racial undertones she could no longer ignore. He spoke often about how fortunate she was that he had chosen her, reminding her that she came from a working-class black family, while he came from generations of white wealth. "Not everyone can rise above where they come from," he told her once after a dinner party, his tone heavy with implication. "But you should be grateful I saw something in you." Alicia bit her tongue, swallowing the anger, but inside she felt the sting of betrayal. The man she had believed loved her, for who she was now seemed determined to remind her she was beneath him. When she honored her father's memory, Richard twisted the knife further. "Your father worked hard," he admitted once, "but he was just a laborer. That's nothing compared to what my family built." Alicia's hands clenched, her heart aching. Her father had been her hero, a man who sacrificed everything so she could dream bigger. To have Richard demean his memory felt like a slap across her soul. She realized in those moments that Richard's prejudice wasn't just about wealth or class. It was about race, about the way he viewed her heritage as something inferior to his own. These comments piled up slowly, each one heavier than the last, until Alicia found herself carrying a weight she could barely manage. At school, she poured her heart into her students, finding strength in their gratitude and their progress. She stayed late tutoring, organized extracurricular activities, and gave encouragement to kids who had no one else to believe in them. Maria, a student who had been struggling after her parents' divorce, told Alicia one day, "You're the only person who didn't give up on me." Those words made Alicia's heart swell, reminding her of her worth, reminding her that she was not just a teacher, but someone changing lives. Yet when she came home, that strength evaporated under Richard's cutting remarks and superior sneers. The contrast between the two worlds was unbearable. In one, she was respected, loved, and needed. In the other, she was diminished, silenced, and reminded daily of how Richard saw her. He began coming home later and later, his phone buzzing with messages he shielded from her eyes. When she asked about his day, he brushed her off, muttering vague excuses about clients. The flowers and grand gestures had vanished, replaced by silence, cold stares, and the smell of whiskey lingering on his breath. Alicia felt invisible, trapped in a marriage that once promised love, but now suffocated her spirit. One night, after he dismissed her yet again in front of his colleagues, Alicia stood in the kitchen alone, tears streaming down her face. She whispered to herself, "You are more than this. You are more than what he says." She clung to her father's lessons, replaying his voice in her mind, reminding her that no man, no prejudice, no wealth could erase her value. But in that house, under Richard's gaze, she struggled to believe it. The weight of prejudice had settled into her marriage, twisting love into something toxic. As she walked toward Richard's study, she heard laughter, the kind of laugh that chilled her blood, sharp and mocking, nothing like the charming smile he once used to win her heart. She slowed her steps, pausing just outside the door, and what she heard next pierced her like a knife. "Trust me, David," Richard's voice boomed. "She has no idea. That naive black teacher thinks I married her for love." Alicia froze, her breath caught in her throat, her pulse hammering in her ears. Richard's voice dripped with contempt as he continued, "Once the divorce is final, I'll have everything. The house, the accounts, even that worthless land her father left her." She signed the papers without even reading them. It's almost too easy. The sound of her husband's laughter roared in her ears, drowning out the very foundation of trust she had clung to. He paused as his friend on the other end said something, then added cruelly, "You're right, I should get an award for this performance. 3 years of pretending to love someone so boring and ordinary, but it's worth it for the payout." Alicia stumbled backward from the door, her chest tightening as though the air itself had turned against her. She wanted to scream, to burst into the room and demand answers, but shock pinned her in place. Her mind replayed his words over and over. Naive black teacher, boring and ordinary performance. Every moment of tenderness, every kiss, every vow had been a lie orchestrated to strip her of everything her father had left her. She pressed her back against the hallway wall, her hands trembling, tears welling up until her vision blurred. She could hear Richard's laughter echoing, carefree, confident, certain of his triumph. She thought of her father, Robert Brown, who had worked double shifts to put food on the table, who had pressed her hands when she cried over his illness and told her, "Never let anyone make you feel small, baby girl. You are worth more than they will ever admit." The weight of those words struck her with devastating clarity now, because she realized Richard had done exactly what her father warned her against. He had convinced her she was small, lucky, undeserving. The betrayal burned hotter than fire. That night, Alicia lay in bed beside Richard as he slept peacefully, his breathing slow and steady, as though he had no conscience, no guilt, no shred of remorse. She stared at the ceiling, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would wake him. Every instinct screamed for her to run, but she forced herself to remain calm. She needed to understand, to gather the truth, to see just how deep his deception ran. The next morning, after Richard left for work, Alicia called in sick, something she rarely did. She sat at the kitchen table surrounded by piles of documents, mortgage papers, bank statements, insurance forms, all signed with her name in careful loops, all drafted by Richard or his lawyers. At first, she thought they were routine, but now she read them with fresh eyes, and the sickening realization grew. The house deed bore only Richard's name, even though her father's land had been listed as collateral. The joint accounts gave him unlimited access, while she required his authorization for large withdrawals. There were forms she barely remembered signing that, upon closer inspection, transferred power over assets she once thought were protected. She buried her face in her hands, grief turning into rage. The man who had promised to cherish and protect her had instead stripped her bare. Each discovery felt like another nail in the coffin of her marriage. She saw how cleverly he had constructed the trap, hiding behind expensive gifts and affectionate words, pushing her to sign without question. His charm had not been love, but strategy. Days blurred into nights as Alicia pieced together the scope of his betrayal. She stayed up late, documents spread across the table, her eyes raw from reading, her mind circling the same devastating thought. Richard had never loved her. He had married her not to share a life, but to steal one. When Richard returned home in the evenings, acting as though nothing had changed, kissing her forehead and calling her sweetheart, Alicia's stomach twisted in revulsion. His voice, once a source of comfort, now sounded like poison. She answered him with curt replies, hiding the storm inside, and he seemed not to notice. That was Richard's arrogance, his belief that she would never suspect, that she would remain blind to his scheme until it was too late. But Alicia was no longer blind. She remembered the way he mocked her father, the way he introduced her as just a teacher, the way he reminded her of her luck in marrying him. It was all part of the performance he bragged about. He had underestimated her strength, underestimated the fire that came from being the daughter of Robert Brown, a man who built resilience out of hardship. Alicia promised herself that night that she would not let Richard take everything. He had taken her trust, her peace, and 3 years of her life, but he would not take her father's legacy. He would not take the dignity that her parents had instilled in her. She would find a way to fight back. As she gathered the papers and hid them in a locked drawer, she whispered a vow into the silence of her home. "You will regret this, Richard." She spent the next morning at the dining room table surrounded by papers, her hands trembling as she traced signatures that belonged to her yet felt foreign, each stroke of her pen taken from her under the false promise of love. She remembered the nights Richard had poured wine, slid documents toward her, and smiled warmly as he told her it was just routine paperwork for the mortgage or the insurance. She had trusted him, blinded by the belief that her husband would never deceive her, and now every page revealed how deep his manipulation went. The house deed was in his name only, despite the fact that her father's land had been used as collateral. Their bank accounts were structured, so he had full control, while her access was limited and monitored. Even her modest savings had been gradually folded into joint investments that only he could withdraw without question. The deeper she read, the sicker she felt. It wasn't just betrayal of a wife by her husband. It was the calculated theft of a white man who had seen her background, her race, and her modest upbringing as vulnerabilities to exploit. He had assumed that because she was a black woman raised without wealth, she would remain forever grateful, forever docile, forever blind. That arrogance filled Alicia with a fury she had never known before. Her father's land, the last tangible piece of him she had left, had been signed into collateral through her own trust in Richard, and now she realized Richard had planned from the beginning to take it from her. She remembered how he used to sneer when she spoke about her father's sacrifices, how he would dismiss him as just a laborer, and remind her of the gap between his own wealthy white family and hers. Every one of those comments had been a warning she had ignored, and now the truth stood before her in black and white. Richard had never respected her, never honored her heritage, never intended to build a life with her. He had intended only to strip her of everything that made her strong. That evening when Richard came home, whistling casually as if the world was his to command, Alicia felt the weight of his betrayal pressing down on her shoulders. He kissed her cheek as though nothing had changed, and she forced herself to stand still, hiding the fury that threatened to spill out. She knew better than to confront him now. She had no plan, no leverage, only the burning truth she had uncovered. Instead, she watched him move through the house as if it belonged only to him, his arrogance dripping from every step, and she vowed silently that she would not allow him to take from her what her father had worked his entire life to preserve. The next day, Alicia returned to the school where she found her only refuge. Her students' faces, bright with possibility, gave her strength. But even there, the betrayal haunted her. She looked at Maria, the girl she had helped secure a scholarship, and thought about how easily Richard dismissed her work as meaningless. She thought about the pride she felt in lifting others, the pride Richard had tried to strip away by reducing her to just a teacher. Alicia realized that what Richard feared most was her independence, because independence meant she could stand without him, and he had built his entire scheme on the belief that she could not. That night, Alicia dug deeper into the paperwork, staying up until dawn. She mapped out the timeline, the accounts, the transfers, each one revealing how Richard had slowly dismantled her independence and replaced it with his control. She saw how carefully he had disguised the theft, hiding behind the guise of marital unity, and she realized it was not just the betrayal of a husband, but the betrayal of a system that allowed a man like him to assume her silence. The marriage certificate that once symbolized unity now felt like a weapon he had wielded against her. When Richard noticed her red eyes at breakfast and asked if she was unwell, Alicia forced a smile and said she was simply tired. Inside, she was unraveling, but beneath the unraveling was a steel thread beginning to weave itself together. She could not yet see how she would fight, but she knew with certainty that fight she must. She knew that revealing her knowledge too soon would leave her unprepared, and Richard's arrogance made it easier for her to remain unnoticed, because he never imagined she had the courage to dig deeper. The weight of what she had learned pressed on her shoulders as she pretended life was unchanged. And then one evening Richard arrived home carrying flowers and a bottle of wine, his smile carefully composed, his manner unusually attentive. Alicia, who had grown used to the cold silences and dismissive remarks that filled their home, immediately sensed that something was wrong. He sat beside her on the couch, placed the flowers on the coffee table, and took her hands as though rehearsing for a scene. "Alicia," he said, his voice smooth and controlled, "we need to talk." Her stomach tightened, but she kept her eyes steady, nodding slightly as if willing to listen. Richard sighed dramatically, as though weighed down by responsibility, and continued, "I think we both know our marriage isn't working. We've grown apart, we want different things, and it would be better for both of us if we ended this." Alicia forced herself not to flinch, not to reveal the storm raging inside her, and instead asked in a steady whisper, "You want a divorce?" Richard nodded, his thumb brushing her knuckles in a gesture that was meant to appear tender but felt like a performance. "Yes, I do, but I want to make this as painless as possible. I've already spoken with my lawyer, and I've had the papers drawn up. You won't have to worry about legal fees or complications. Everything has been made very straightforward." He reached down, pulled out a manila folder, and set it gently on the table between them as though it were an offering. Alicia stared at it, her heart pounding, knowing what it contained before she even opened it. Richard smiled faintly, leaning back with the confidence of a man who believed he was in complete control. "All you have to do is sign, and we can both move on with our lives. You'll get enough money to start fresh, maybe rent a nice apartment, maybe even go back to school if you want to. I'm not a heartless man. I want you to be taken care of." Alicia wanted to scream at him, to throw the folder across the room, to tell him she had heard his phone call and read the documents he had tricked her into signing, but she bit her tongue until it almost bled. Instead she asked, "And the house?" Richard's smile widened, his tone carefully sympathetic. "The house is in my name, and I've been the one paying for it. But don't worry, I'm not cruel. You'll have enough to get settled somewhere else. You'll be fine." Alicia's breath caught, but she forced her voice to remain even. "And my father's land?" For a flicker of a moment, Richard's mask slipped, his eyes narrowing before he quickly composed himself again. "Alicia, we've been through this. The land is collateral for our mortgage. When the house is sold, the debt has to be settled, and whatever remains will go toward that. But like I said, the settlement will take care of you. You have nothing to worry about." His words rang like poison in her ears. Alicia knew now with certainty that he was lying, that he had built this entire plan to strip her of her inheritance, and that he expected her to be too trusting or too naive to see it. She stared at the folder on the table, her hands trembling, and forced herself to whisper, "I need time to think." Richard's smile faltered for just a second, then returned, tighter than before. "Of course, sweetheart. Take all the time you need. But my lawyer says the sooner we file, the easier it will be for both of us." He kissed her cheek and stood, leaving the folder where it sat, believing that his performance had worked. Alicia waited until he left the room before opening the folder, and what she saw inside only confirmed the depths of his betrayal. The divorce settlement offered her a small stipend, enough to live modestly for a year or two if she was careful, but stripped her of everything else. The house, the cars, the investment accounts, and yes, her father's land, all were to go to Richard under the guise of fairness. The documents claimed the land would be sold to cover marital debts, and any remaining value would be awarded to Richard as compensation for his financial contributions. Alicia's hands shook as she turned the pages, her rage boiling, her heart aching as she realized how close she had come to signing away her entire legacy. If she had not overheard that phone call, if she had not investigated the documents, she might have believed him, might have thought he was being generous, and she would have walked away with nothing but a fraction of her worth. That night, Alicia barely slept, her mind racing, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. She could not let him win, but she knew she could not fight him alone. Richard had money, lawyers, and power on his side, and she had only the truth. Yet the truth burned brightly enough to give her strength. The next day, she drove to the office of a colleague's recommended attorney, Lorraine Carter, a seasoned black lawyer known for her toughness in family cases. Alicia poured out her story, her voice shaking but her determination clear, and Lorraine listened without interruption, her expression hardening with each detail. When Alicia finished, Lorraine leaned forward and said, "Sarah, if you signed all those documents, it's going to be an uphill battle. But it's not impossible. We'll need to be strategic. Tell me about your father's land." Lorraine had built a reputation in Atlanta as a fearless advocate, a black woman who had battled through a system often designed to favor the powerful. And Alicia knew instinctively she had found the ally she needed. Lorraine's first advice echoed in her mind as she drove home. "We have to find out the true value of that land your father left you. Don't take your husband's word for it. Men like him count on women like you to underestimate yourselves." Alicia clenched the steering wheel, replaying Richard's smug assurances that the land was worthless, that it was perfect collateral, because no one would care if it was lost. Those words now stank of manipulation, and Alicia realized how often Richard had steered her into decisions by mocking her background. He had known that questioning his judgment would make her feel ungrateful, so she had stayed quiet, trusting him. And now she saw how dangerous that silence had been. That night she spread the divorce papers across the table again, reading them with Lorraine's voice in her head. Every line screamed of Richard's arrogance, his certainty that she would sign without resistance, his belief that she was too naive to suspect his greed. Alicia stared at her signature on older documents, her chest aching at how easily she had handed over power, and for a moment despair threatened to drag her under again. But then she remembered Lorraine's words. "This is not over. Your husband has underestimated you. That is his weakness, not yours." For the first time, Alicia felt something stir inside her that was stronger than grief: resolve. Over the next week, she met with Lorraine repeatedly. They combed through every detail of her financial history, every scrap of her father's records that she could find. Alicia had kept boxes of papers in the attic, old tax returns, handwritten notes, even receipts from the plant where her father worked. She had always thought of them as mementos, tokens of a life lived modestly. But now Lorraine examined them like puzzle pieces, piecing together a picture that Alicia had never considered. One afternoon, Lorraine looked up from a stack of documents, her expression thoughtful. "Your father may not have been wealthy, Alicia, but he was careful. I see signs here that he invested small amounts in company stock, maybe even bonds. He might have left behind more than you realize." Alicia felt her throat tighten. She had grown up believing her father lived paycheck to paycheck, and while it was true money had been tight, she also remembered the way he would sometimes nod quietly at the newspaper's business section, his brow furrowed in concentration. Could it be that he had been preparing something for her all along? Lorraine pressed further. "I also want a professional appraisal of that land. Property values have changed a lot in the last decade, especially in rural areas with natural resources. Do not assume it is worthless. Sometimes what looks ordinary hides value others would kill to possess." Alicia agreed, her mind racing. Every time she thought of the land, she remembered walking there with her father as a child, the rough grass under her shoes, the smell of the barn's old wood, his strong hand holding hers. He had never spoken of it as valuable, only as a place that belonged to the family, a place she should protect. Now she wondered if he had known more than he let on. At home, Richard remained oblivious. He continued playing the role of the generous husband preparing to set her free with his tidy settlement, never noticing that Alicia no longer looked at him with adoration but with cold calculation. She endured his smug remarks with silence, storing her strength for the courtroom she now knew was inevitable. Every sneer, every patronizing pat on the hand, every reminder of her humble background only fueled her determination. She thought often of her students, of Maria, who had told her she changed her life, and she realized that Richard's greatest mistake was assuming she had no fight in her. He mistook kindness for weakness, patience for submission, and dignity for silence. He had no idea that the very traits he dismissed were the ones that would carry her through the storm. The day of the land appraisal, Alicia stood on the property with the surveyors, the autumn air crisp around her, and felt her father's presence. She watched as professionals tested the soil, checked geological surveys, and spoke in hushed tones about potential deposits beneath the surface. She didn't understand all the details, but she understood enough to see the flicker of excitement in their eyes, the quick exchange of numbers that hinted at something big. When Lorraine called later with the initial findings, Alicia nearly dropped the phone. The land was not worthless. It sat on top of a natural gas deposit that could be worth millions. Alicia's heart pounded as tears filled her eyes, not from sorrow, but from awe. Her father had left her something more powerful than she ever imagined, and Richard, in his arrogance, had dismissed it as nothing. That moment changed everything. Alicia no longer saw herself as trapped but as armed, carrying a weapon Richard never knew she possessed. Lorraine's research went further, uncovering records of a trust fund her father had established before his death. It had lain dormant, unnoticed, because Alicia's married name had confused the bank, but with interest and careful investments it had grown into millions. Alicia sat in Lorraine's office, stunned, her hands covering her mouth as she whispered, "He knew. He knew I would need protection." Lorraine nodded gently. "Your father was a wise man. He may not have had much, but he planned carefully. He wanted you to be secure, Alicia. He wanted to shield you from exactly the kind of man Richard turned out to be." Alicia left the office that day with a renewed sense of purpose. The betrayal that once crushed her now fueled her determination. The discovery of the natural gas deposit beneath the land Richard Miller had mocked as worthless, and the dormant trust fund that had grown into millions was more than money. It was proof that her father had always believed in her worth and had quietly prepared to protect her even after his death. As she stood in her living room staring at the folder of documents Lorraine had given her, Alicia whispered to herself, "Daddy knew. He always knew." The memory of his calloused hands guiding hers as a child, his steady voice telling her to never let anyone make her feel small, now echoed with greater clarity, and she realized his wisdom had been more far-reaching than she had understood. Richard, in his arrogance, had underestimated not only Alicia, but also the foresight of the man he belittled as just a laborer. That realization fueled Alicia's determination to fight back, to no longer cower beneath Richard's shadow. Over the following days, Alicia worked closely with Lorraine, building the case with meticulous care. Lorraine's confidence was contagious, and Alicia found herself studying every document, learning how Richard had maneuvered the finances, how he had lied with a smile, how he had hidden behind the mask of a generous husband. Each new piece of evidence no longer crushed her, but hardened her resolve. She was not a victim anymore. She was preparing for war. Yet at home, she kept her composure, knowing Richard remained oblivious to the storm gathering around him. He continued to strut through the house, dropping casual reminders of her luck in marrying him, as if rehearsing his performance for the courtroom. And Alicia bit her tongue, her eyes steady, her silence now not from fear, but from strategy. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, Richard leaned back in his chair and said smugly, "You'll thank me one day for how simple I've made this for you. Without me, you'd still be struggling as a schoolteacher with no future." Alicia looked at him, her face calm though her heart burned. She thought of the trust account worth millions, of the land that could secure her family for generations. And she knew in that moment that Richard's words were empty. He was blind to the truth, blind to the strength her father had placed in her hands. And she realized with startling clarity that the power in the room no longer belonged to him. That night Alicia found herself unable to sleep. She sat by the window, staring at the stars, thinking of her father, and the tears that slid down her cheeks were not only of sorrow, but of gratitude. "You believed in me, Daddy," she whispered. "You knew I would need this, And you made sure I would be safe. I promise I won't waste it. I promise I will fight." She thought of her students, of the young black children who looked to her for guidance. And she realized that her father's hidden strength was not only for her protection, but also for her to pass on, a legacy of dignity and resilience that stretched beyond money. The next week, Lorraine prepared Alicia for the upcoming hearings. "We can't reveal everything yet," Lorraine explained. "If we show our hand too soon, Richard's lawyers will scramble to spin the story. Let him believe he has the upper hand until the judge is listening. That's when we strike." Alicia nodded, her nerves taut, but she trusted Lorraine's strategy. Richard was too confident, too arrogant, to suspect that the woman he dismissed as naive was preparing to dismantle him piece by piece. In the quiet moments, Alicia found herself reflecting on the irony of it all. Richard had chosen her because he believed she would be easy to control, that as a black woman from a modest family, she would forever feel indebted to him. And yet it was precisely her background, her father's foresight, and her resilience that would undo him. She thought of how often he had dismissed her father's memory, and she smiled bitterly, knowing that the man he scorned had outsmarted him long before Alicia even realized it. As the court date drew closer, Alicia felt the tension rise. Richard's demeanor became even more smug, as though he relished the idea of watching her humiliated in front of a judge, forced to accept his carefully orchestrated settlement. He spoke casually of their future apart, saying things like, "You'll be fine, Alicia. I've made sure of it. I'll always be generous, even when you're no longer my wife." Each word fueled her determination, and she began to imagine the look on his face when he learned the truth, when the judge read aloud the evidence of her inheritance, when his scheme collapsed in front of the world. She rehearsed her composure in the mirror, reminding herself to stay calm, to let Lorraine carry the arguments, to remember that silence could be louder than anger when the truth was on her side. The night before the hearing, Alicia returned to her father's land. She walked through the fields, the grass whispering in the wind, the old barn creaking as though it still held his spirit. She stood still, breathing in the familiar scent of soil and wood, and placed her hand on the weathered beams. "I will protect this," she said softly. "I will not let him take it from me. You gave me this gift, and I will honor it." The stars shone above her, steady and unyielding, and she felt her father's presence as surely as if he stood beside her. When she returned home, Richard was already asleep, sprawled across the bed as though the world belonged to him. Alicia looked at him, no longer with love or sorrow, but with a clear, steady gaze. She saw him now for what he truly was, a fraud, a manipulator, a man so blinded by his prejudice and arrogance that he could not see the strength of the woman he had tried to destroy. Together they walked into the building, the echoes of their footsteps blending with the murmurs of attorneys, clerks, and families preparing for their cases. Inside the courtroom, Richard Miller was already seated, his posture relaxed, his expensive suit tailored to perfection, his lips curled in the smug smile of a man who believed the outcome had already been written. His legal team surrounded him, carrying briefcases stuffed with documents, exuding the kind of arrogance that assumed money always dictated truth. Richard glanced at Alicia with a mixture of pity and superiority, shaking his head slightly as though to say, "You don't belong here." Alicia met his gaze without flinching, her silence sharper than any retort. When the judge entered and the proceedings began, Richard's attorney rose confidently, presenting their case as though it were a mere formality. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "my client has been more than generous. He has provided his wife with a fair settlement despite her limited contributions to the marital estate. The house, the accounts, the investments, all of these were primarily funded by Mr. Miller's income. Mrs. Brown will walk away with enough to build a new life, and Mr. Miller is prepared to ensure her transition is comfortable." Alicia sat still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, while Lorraine leaned over and whispered, "Let them talk. The higher they climb, the harder the fall." Richard nodded along with his attorney, his expression serious, but his eyes flickering toward Alicia with the gleam of a man savoring a private victory. He believed she was beaten, that the woman he once mocked as a naive black teacher had no chance against his wealth and legal power. When it was Lorraine's turn to speak, She rose with deliberate calm, her voice measured and clear. "Your Honor, while opposing counsel paints this case as simple, there are facts that have been deliberately concealed. Mrs. Brown's inheritance from her late father has been misrepresented, and we have evidence that Mr. Miller has acted with deception to gain control of assets that do not belong to him." Richard shifted in his seat, his smile faltering slightly as the judge turned her sharp gaze toward Lorraine. "Proceed," the judge instructed, and Lorraine opened her folder, pulling out the documents Alicia had spent weeks gathering. "The land in question," Lorraine continued, "has been described by Mr. Miller as of little value, collateral to be disposed of. But recent geological surveys reveal otherwise. The land sits atop a natural gas deposit, appraised at $12 million. The words hung in the air like thunder. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and Richard's attorney froze, his mouth opening and closing before he could form a response. Richard himself went pale, his eyes darting from Lorraine to Alicia, disbelief etched into his face. Lorraine did not pause. Furthermore, Mrs. Brown's father established a trust fund before his death, designed specifically to remain separate from any marital property. That trust now contains over $2 million. These funds were never disclosed by Mr. Miller and remain the sole property of Mrs. Brown. Alicia felt her heart pound, but she kept her face calm, her gaze steady on the judge. She would not give Richard the satisfaction of seeing her triumph too early. The judge leaned forward, her tone stern. "Mr. Miller, were you aware of these assets?" Richard stammered, his confidence collapsing. "No, Your Honor, I had no idea. I thought the land was worthless. Lorraine raised her hand, silencing him as she placed another piece of evidence on the table. "Your Honor, we also have a recorded phone conversation in which Mr. Miller openly admits to marrying my client under false pretenses, boasting about his plan to divorce her and seize her father's property. He described her as, and I quote, a naive black teacher too easy to control." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the weight of those words crashing against Richard like a tidal wave. The judge slammed her gavel for silence, her eyes narrowing at Richard. "Mr. Miller, is this true?" Richard's attorney tried to interject, begging for more time to review, but the judge's voice cut through the noise with finality. "No delays. The evidence is clear. Mr. Miller, your conduct is fraudulent and reprehensible. The prenuptial agreement is void due to concealment and bad faith. Mrs. Brown will retain full ownership of her inheritance, including the land and trust. Additionally, she is entitled to half of all marital property, and you will pay her legal fees in full." Alicia exhaled slowly, her chest lightening as relief and vindication washed over her. She turned her head just enough to see Richard slump back in his chair, his face drained of color, his jaw tight with rage and humiliation. The man who had mocked her father, belittled her work, and underestimated her worth was now exposed before the law and stripped of the power he believed was untouchable. Lorraine placed a steady hand on Alicia's arm, whispering, "You did it. You held your ground." As they left the courtroom, reporters buzzed outside, curious about the stunning reversal. Richard tried to approach her in the parking lot, his voice desperate, but Alicia stopped him with a single look. She spoke quietly, her tone steady and resolute. Lorraine Carter's steady presence beside her was a constant reminder that she had not walked this journey alone, that she had found an ally who believed in her when Richard thought she had no fight left. As the courtroom emptied, the echo of murmurs trailing in the wake of the shocking verdict, Alicia remained seated for a moment, gathering herself, breathing deeply, reminding herself that she had won not by lowering herself to Richard's level, but by standing firmly in her dignity. When she finally rose, Richard was still seated, his eyes burning with humiliation, his once confident smirk replaced with desperation. He muttered something to his lawyer, who looked pale and shaken, before he tried to catch Alicia's attention. "We need to talk," he said hoarsely, but Alicia did not falter. She turned her head slowly and met his gaze with a calmness that unsettled him more than any angry outburst could have. "No, Richard," she said quietly but firmly. "The only misunderstanding here was mine. I thought you loved me. I thought you respected me. But you loved only control, and you respected nothing but power. You underestimated me, and that was your downfall." She walked past him, Lorraine at her side, each step away from him feeling like the reclaiming of ground he had stolen over the years. Outside the courthouse, the autumn air felt crisp and alive, the sun shining through the clouds like a benediction, as though her father himself was watching. Reporters swarmed, their voices overlapping, but Alicia kept her composure, offering only a few words. The truth always matters. Dignity always matters. Lorraine guided her to the car, and as the door closed behind her, Alicia let out a shaky laugh that surprised even her. She felt like a survivor crawling out of rubble, blinking against the light, realizing that the nightmare was finally over. Yet she also knew it was more than survival. It was vindication. Back at home, Alicia sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, the same table where she had once spread out papers that revealed her betrayal. The same table where Richard had slid the manila folder toward her with false tenderness, believing she would sign away her life. Now the table held only her quiet strength. She looked at the flowers Richard had given her that night, still wilting in their vase, and she picked them up and threw them into the trash, watching the petals scatter like ashes. Her phone buzzed with messages from friends and colleagues who had followed the case, their words of support reminding her of the community she had outside the gilded cage Richard had built. "We're so proud of you," one message read. Another said, "You showed all of us what courage looks like." Alicia smiled softly, grateful not just for their support, but for the reminder that her worth had always been greater than Richard's attempts to erase it. That evening, Richard called, his number flashing across her phone screen. She let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering, her voice steady. "Alicia, please," he said immediately, his tone desperate, stripped of the arrogance that once defined him. "We can fix this. I made mistakes, I said things I shouldn't have, but we can work it out. You know I cared about you." Alicia closed her eyes, letting the silence stretch before responding. "You cared about what you could take from me. You cared about feeling superior, but you never cared about me." Richard tried again, his voice cracking. "I was wrong. I see it now. Please, don't end this like this. We had good times, didn't we?" Alicia took a deep breath and answered with finality. "The man I married was a lie. The good times were a performance. And the woman you thought you could control is not the woman standing here now. Goodbye, Richard." She hung up, her hand steady, her heart surprisingly calm. It was over, truly over, not just in the eyes of the law, but in her own heart. Over the following weeks, Alicia worked with Lorraine to secure the assets the judge had awarded her, ensuring the land remained in her name and the trust fund was transferred properly. Each step forward was a reminder of her father's foresight, his quiet strength reaching across the years to protect her. She visited the land again, walking its wide fields, touching the weathered barn, feeling his presence in every corner. She thought of how Richard had mocked it as worthless and smiled, knowing now it was a symbol of endurance, a value unseen by arrogant eyes. At school, Alicia returned to her students with renewed energy. They noticed the change in her, the steadiness in her voice, the new light in her eyes. Maria hugged her one afternoon and whispered, "You look stronger, Miss Brown. Like nothing can knock you down." Alicia held her close and whispered back, "That's because I remembered who I am." The settlement money and her inheritance gave her security, but it was not the money that defined her victory. It was the knowledge that she had reclaimed her dignity, that she had proven to herself that she was more than Richard's insults, more than the prejudice he embodied, more than the chains he tried to place on her. One Sunday morning, Alicia sat with Lorraine at church, the choir's voices rising around them, and she felt tears slide down her cheeks as she thought of her father. She imagined him sitting in his favorite pew, his quiet pride shining in his eyes, and she whispered under her breath, "We did it, Daddy. You protected me, and I honored you." Lorraine squeezed her hand, understanding without words. In that moment, Alicia knew that justice was not only served in the courtroom, but in her soul, because justice meant more than punishing Richard. It meant remembering her own worth and carrying her father's legacy forward. Richard would fade into obscurity, another man undone by his arrogance, but Alicia would rise, a teacher, a daughter, a black woman who had endured betrayal and emerged with her head held high. Alicia Brown stood at the threshold of a new chapter, the weight of a courtroom battle behind her, but the lessons carved deep into her spirit. The weeks after the verdict were filled with practical matters, meetings with bankers, appraisers, and lawyers ensuring that the trust fund and the land her father had left her were secured beyond dispute. But even as she handled the logistics, Alicia understood that her real victory was not in the numbers on paper, but in the transformation within herself. She had walked into her marriage with Richard Miller, believing she was lucky that a wealthy white man had chosen her, believing that her role was to be grateful, silent, and pliant. She had allowed herself to shrink under his arrogance, to swallow his prejudice, and to believe his cruel insinuations that she was less. But through betrayal, through humiliation, through the cruel discovery of his deception and the courtroom showdown that followed, Alicia had learned that her worth had never been defined by his validation. Her worth was built in the long hours she spent teaching students who others had given up on, in the sacrifices of her father who had invested quietly in her future, and in the unbreakable dignity she carried as a black woman in a world that tried to erase her strength. Standing on her father's land again, the wide expanse of grass stretching beneath the golden sky, Alicia placed her hands on the weathered wood of the old barn and whispered, "We made it, Daddy." The tears that filled her eyes were not of sorrow, but of gratitude, because she now understood that her father had known the world would not always be kind to her, had known that prejudice and arrogance might one day rise against her, and had prepared for that day with foresight and love. His trust fund and the land were more than financial assets. They were symbols of belief, of protection, of a legacy that told her she was always worth more than others might admit. Alicia made a decision then that would define the next phase of her life. She would not let Richard's betrayal be the final note in her story. She would not let his arrogance, his prejudice, or his attempt to strip her of dignity become her legacy. Instead, she would transform her victory into something larger, something that reached beyond herself. With Lorraine Carter's help, she established the Robert Brown Scholarship Fund, dedicated to supporting black students from working-class families who dreamed of higher education but lacked the resources. When she announced the fund at a community meeting, her voice trembled with emotion as she told the story of her father's sacrifices and his hidden strength. The crowd rose to its feet, applauding not just her resilience but her vision, and Alicia felt her father's spirit smiling through every cheer. Richard's name was no longer spoken in her world, except in whispers of cautionary tales. He faded into irrelevance, his wealth diminished, his reputation tarnished by the exposure of his deceit. Alicia did not hate him anymore, she pitied him. He had built his life on control, on prejudice, on the false belief that power came from possessions. And in the end, he had nothing because he had never cultivated character. She understood now that her greatest revenge was not in his humiliation, but in her thriving, in her ability to rise above the pain he inflicted and to turn it into purpose. Back in her classroom, Alicia's students noticed the change in her. She stood taller, spoke with greater conviction, and carried an energy that inspired them. When Maria, the young girl she had once helped through hardship, asked her why she seemed different, Alicia smiled and said, "Because I finally remembered what my father always told me, that no one has the right to tell you what you're worth. You decide that for yourself." Her words spread through the room like fire, igniting hope in students who needed to hear them, and Alicia knew she was doing exactly what she had been born to do. Months later, at the Scholarship Fund's first award ceremony, Alicia addressed the crowd of families and students gathered in the auditorium. She told them about her father's quiet resilience, about the legacy of foresight he had left, and about the trial that had tested her but not broken her. She ended with a message that resonated through the hall. Real wealth is not about money. It is about security, dignity, and the ability to lift others when they stumble. Prejudice will try to convince you that you are less. Arrogance will try to silence you. Betrayal will try to break you. But none of that defines you. What defines you is the strength you carry, the kindness you show, and the belief that you are worthy of respect. The audience rose to their feet in applause, and Alicia felt peace settle over her heart. She had not only survived Richard's betrayal, but had transformed it into something that would outlast him. something that would honor her father's memory and inspire future generations. As she left the auditorium that night, the crisp air filled her lungs, and the stars glittered above like reminders of all that was possible. She knew her journey was far from over, that life would bring new challenges, but she also knew she had the strength to meet them. Her father's hidden strength had become her own, and now she would pass it on to others. In the end, Alicia Brown's story was not about a cruel husband or a courtroom battle. It was about dignity rediscovered, about prejudice confronted, and about the enduring power of love between a father and a daughter. It was about rising above betrayal, finding freedom in truth, and choosing to transform pain into purpose. And as she walked forward into her future, Alicia carried one unshakable truth in her heart. She was worthy. She had always been worthy, and no one could take that away from her. The end. If you've been with me through Alicia's journey, you know this story wasn't just about betrayal. It was about dignity, resilience, and rising above prejudice to claim what was always hers. If you felt her pain, her fight, and her triumph, I would love for you to support this channel by subscribing and giving this video a like. It helps us share more stories that carry meaning and strength. I also want to hear from you. What part of Alicia's journey struck you the hardest, and what would you have done in her shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments. And while you're there, let me know where you're watching from. It's always powerful to see people from all around the world connecting over these stories.